I've spent 30 years looking people in the eye and telling them the one thing they usually don't want to hear, that the common denominator in all their failed relationships, all their career setbacks, and all their personal misery is the person looking back at them in the mirror. It is a hard, cold reality to swallow, and most people would rather choke on a lie than digest the truth. They want to talk about their boss, their ex-wife, their childhood, or the economy, because as long as the problem is out there, they don't have to do the work in here. But when I met Leo, I saw a level of externalized blame that was so polished, so practiced, it had become a work of art. He wasn't just avoiding responsibility, he had built a cathedral of excuses and expected everyone else to worship at the altar of his perceived victimhood. It's a specific kind of arrogance that masquerades as injury. And I knew the moment he walked into the studio that we weren't just dealing with a man who had fallen on hard times. We were dealing with a man who had used his own ego to build a prison and was now complaining that the walls were closing in on him. Leo was 38 years old, but he carried himself with the wounded entitlement of a prince who had been unjustly exiled. He was tall, well-groomed, and had a way of looking past people rather than at them. When he sat down in my office before the cameras even started rolling, he didn't ask how I was or acknowledge the gravity of why he was there. Instead, he complained about the lighting in the green room and the fact that the water provided wasn't the brand he preferred. That tells me everything I need to know before a single word of therapy begins. It's the look-at-me behavior of a person who believes the world is a stage and everyone else is just a poorly paid extra in the movie of his life. His mother, Martha, was sitting next to him, looking like she had been carved out of exhaustion. She was 72, still working a full-time job as a nurse to support her nearly 40-year-old son who hadn't held a job for more than 3 months in the last decade. The central problem wasn't just that Leo was unemployed, it was that he believed he was too important to be employed by anyone who didn't recognize his genius. He had been labeled a narcissist by his previous therapist, by his ex-wife, and by his own siblings, but to Leo, those weren't diagnoses. They were badges of honor, proof that he was simply too complex for normal people to understand. When I look at a case like this, I have to peel back the layers of the why. Nobody wakes up at 38 and decides to be a burden on their elderly mother just for the fun of it. There is a pattern of behavior, a blueprint that was laid down years, sometimes decades earlier. As I began to dig into Leo's history, the picture became clearer. And it wasn't the picture he wanted me to see. He talked about his childhood as if it were a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. He told me his father was emotionally distant and unsupportive of his artistic vision. He told me his teachers were threatened by his intellect. But when I spoke to Martha privately, the reality was much more mundane and much more damaging. Leo had been the golden child. He was bright, yes, and he was handsome, but every time he bumped into a challenge, Martha was there to move the obstacle. If he got a bad grade, she complained to the school. If he got cut from a team, she told him the coach was biased. He never learned how to fail, and because he never learned how to fail, he never learned how to grow. He grew up believing that he was entitled to a life of ease and recognition without the sweat equity that usually buys it. The backstory of a narcissist is often a story of overindulgence masking a deep-seated insecurity. By the time Leo reached his 20s, he had developed a psychological outer shell that was impenetrable. He went to college for film, then for music, then for philosophy, never finishing a single degree because the professors didn't get it. He got married to a woman who, at first, bought into his misunderstood genius persona, but the reality of living with a man who contributes nothing but criticism eventually wore her down. When she left him, he didn't look at his own behavior. He told himself she was too small-minded to handle his destiny. He moved back into his mother's spare bedroom, and for the next 8 years, he lived a life of quiet, parasitic luxury. He spent his days on projects that never came to fruition, and his nights lecturing his mother on how she was stifling his creative energy by asking him to help with the grocery bills. It's a dynamic I've seen 1,000 times, the enabler and the predator bound together in a dance of resentment and guilt. As the weeks leading up to the show progressed, the escalation in the household had reached a breaking point. Martha's health was failing. She had developed a tremor in her hands, likely from the chronic stress of working double shifts and coming home to a son who treated her like a maid. She had finally told him that he needed to get a job at the local warehouse, not a creative director position, not a visionary role, but a job moving boxes for $15 an hour. Leo's reaction wasn't just anger, it was a psychological meltdown. He accused her of trying to kill his soul. He told her that if he took a job like that, he would be admitting that he was nobody, and he couldn't live with that. The tension in that house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Leo started withdrawing even more, refusing to leave his room and sending his mother long, rambling emails about his depression and trauma, using the language of mental health as a weapon to keep her from setting boundaries. This is what narcissists do. They take the very things meant to help people and they weaponize them to maintain control. He wasn't depressed, he was pouting because the world wasn't bowing. The breaking point came when Martha forgot to pick up a specific type of organic coffee Leo liked. He had a tantrum that lasted 3 hours, ending with him throwing a chair across the kitchen. Not because he wanted the coffee, but because the disrespect of her forgetting his needs was an assault on his fragile ego. That was the day Martha called our producers. She was terrified not just of her son's temper, but of the fact that she was dying and he was completely unequipped to survive without her. She realized she hadn't been loving him all these years, she had been crippling him. And Leo, in his infinite arrogance, agreed to come on the show because he thought I would be his ally. He thought I would look at his intellect and his vision and tell his mother that she was indeed the problem. He came to me looking for a platform to broadcast his grievances. But what he didn't realize was that when you step into my arena, the only thing that gets a platform is the truth. I watched him as we prepared to go on stage. He was checking his reflection in the monitors, adjusting his collar, practicing his thoughtful face. He had no idea that I had spent the morning talking to his ex-wife, his former employers, and his sister. I had a file an inch thick of people who had tried to help him, only to be bitten for their efforts. The stage was set for a confrontation that he thought he was going to win. But the thing about a narcissist is that they are always playing a game where the rules are entirely in their head. They think we can out-talk, out-logic, and outmaneuver anyone. But I don't play games. I look at the behavior, because the behavior is the only thing that doesn't lie. I knew that within the first 10 minutes of the interview, I was going to have to strip away that misunderstood genius mask and show him the scared, lazy, and deeply selfish man underneath. It wasn't going to be pretty and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only chance he had at a life that wasn't a total sham. The lights in the studio are bright, but they don't illuminate anything that isn't already there. They just make it impossible to hide. As Leo walked out and took his seat, the audience gave him a polite round of applause, but he took it in as if he were a conquering hero returning from a long campaign. He sat down, crossed his legs, and leaned back with a level of comfort that was almost insulting given the circumstances. I started the way I always do, by laying out the facts as I see them. I told the audience about Leo's potential, his various unfinished degrees, and his current living situation. I watched his face as I spoke. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look embarrassed. He had this slight, knowing smirk on his face, the kind of look someone gives when they think they're the smartest person in the room and they're just waiting for everyone else to catch up. I knew that smirk. It's the shield of the narcissist. It's a way of saying, You're talking about a version of me that doesn't exist, and I'm far superior to your petty descriptions. When I turned the floor over to him, he didn't miss a beat. He started talking about his process. He used big academic words to describe why he hadn't been able to hold down a job at a marketing firm or even a bookstore. He spoke about structural dissonance and the commodification of the creative spirit. He was trying to intellectually intimidate me to turn a conversation about his laziness into a debate about philosophy. I let him talk for a few minutes because I wanted the audience, and more importantly, I wanted Martha to see the absurdity of it. Here was a man whose mother was literally working herself into an early grave to buy him organic kale and high-speed internet. And he was talking about the existential weight of corporate compliance. It was a masterclass in deflection. Every time I tried to pin him down on a specific fact, like the time he was fired for refusing to wear a uniform, he would pivot to a grander, more abstract theory about personal autonomy. I looked over at Martha. She was shrinking into her chair. Every word out of Leo's mouth seemed to take a little more of the air out of her lungs. I asked her, Martha, when he talks like this, what do you hear? She looked at her hands and said, I hear that I'm not smart enough to understand why he can't help me. That was the heart of the matter. Leo's narcissism wasn't just a personality trait, it was a tool of oppression. He used his perceived intellectual superiority to keep his mother in a state of perpetual confusion and guilt. If she challenged him, she was unrefined or anti-intellectual. It's a classic gaslighting technique. You make the other person feel like their very reasonable expectations, like please help pay the electricity bill, are actually signs of their own narrow-mindedness. I've seen it 100 times, and it never fails to turn my stomach. I decided it was time to change the temperature in the room. I said, Leo, you've spent about 10 minutes telling me why you're too big for the world. I want to talk about why the world thinks you're too small. I brought up the interview I had with his former boss at a small advertising agency. This was a man who had hired Leo as a favor to a family friend, thinking a creative mind would be an asset. The boss told us that within 2 weeks, Leo was telling the senior partners how to run their firm. He was showing up 2 hours late because he worked better in the moonlight. When he was finally fired, he told the entire office that they were relegating themselves to mediocrity and that they would regret losing him. I asked Leo, were they relegated to mediocrity, or were they just tired of paying a guy who didn't do any work? Leo's smirk didn't flicker. He said, they were a boutique firm with no vision, Phil. I was trying to save them from themselves. That's the thing about a narcissist. They don't have a fail state. In their mind, every rejection is just proof of the world's inadequacy. If a woman leaves them, she wasn't deep enough. If a boss fires them, he was threatened by them. If a mother asks for rent, she's trapped in a capitalistic mindset. They are the heroes of a story where every other character is a villain or a fool. I told him, you're not a visionary, Leo. You're a 38-year-old man who is living off a pension meant for a 72-year-old woman's retirement. You're not saving anyone, you're a parasite. The word parasite usually gets a reaction. Most people would flinch or get defensive. Leo just tilted his head and said, that's a very reductive way of looking at a complex family dynamic. He was completely detached from the emotional reality of what he was doing. We moved into the escalation of the family conflict. I played a clip of an argument Martha had recorded on her phone, a common thing I ask guests to do so we can see what happens when the cameras aren't there. In the recording, you could hear Martha crying, asking Leo to please just go to one job interview at a local retail store. Leo's voice was cold, precise, and incredibly cruel. He told her she was peasant-minded. He told her that her anxiety was a toxin that was ruining his ability to create. He told her that if she really loved him, she would protect his gift instead of trying to turn him into a drone. Listening to it in the studio, the silence was deafening. You could feel the collective weight of the audience's realization. This wasn't just a lazy guy. This was a man who was psychologically battering his mother to maintain his own delusions of grandeur. I asked Leo how he felt hearing that. He said, "I think it's unfortunate that my mother felt the need to record a private moment of frustration. It shows a lack of trust." He was still blaming her. Even caught red-handed in a moment of absolute cruelty, his first instinct was to criticize the person who caught him. I looked at him and said, "Leo, do you even like your mother?" He paused, for the first time looking a bit caught off guard. "Of course I do," he said. "Then why are you killing her?" I asked. I laid out the medical facts. Her blood pressure was through the roof. She was exhausted. She was losing weight. She was literally breaking under the weight of his gift. I told him, "You say you love her, but your actions say you're using her up until there's nothing left but a husk. And then you'll probably complain that the husk isn't providing enough shade." The escalation continued when I brought out his sister, Sarah. Sarah hadn't spoken to Leo in 3 years. She sat as far away from him as the couch would allow. She didn't have Martha's patience or her guilt. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. She told the story of how Leo had stolen money from her wedding fund a decade ago, claiming it was an investment in his first film, a film that was never made. When she confronted him, he told her she was materialistic and that art is more important than a party. Sarah looked at me and said, "He's been doing this his whole life, Dr. Phil." He finds the person with the softest heart and he eats them alive. Leo tried to interrupt to contextualize the theft, but I shut him down. I told him, "Sit there and listen. For once in your life, you are not the narrator. You are a character in everyone else's nightmare." The tension on the stage was vibrating. We were moving past the he said, she said, and getting into the core of the pathology. Leo was starting to get agitated. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. He started tapping his foot, a rhythmic, nervous movement that betrayed the cool exterior he was trying to maintain. He was losing control of the narrative. And for a narcissist, losing control is the equivalent of dying. He started looking at the exits. He started looking at his watch. He tried to pull the "I don't have to sit here and be insulted" card, but I reminded him that he signed up for this. He wanted the world to see him. Well, now we were seeing him. We were seeing the entitlement, the coldness, and the absolute lack of empathy for the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. I told him, "We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the why, because I don't believe you're this cruel by accident. I think you've built this whole persona because you are terrified of what happens if you're just an ordinary man. You'd rather be a misunderstood genius who fails than an ordinary man who tries. Because if you try and you still fail, then you have to admit you're not special. And that, Leo, is the one thing you can't survive." He didn't look at me, he looked at the floor. The genuous was starting to crack, and the man underneath was looking smaller by the second. Coming back from the break, the air in the studio had changed. The audience was no longer just curious. They were leaning in, their faces a mix of judgment and genuine concern for Martha. Leo, on the other hand, had used a 3-minute pause to try and rebuild his crumbling exterior. He was sitting even more rigidly now, his chin tilted up, trying to project a sense of being above it all. But I could see the sweat on his upper lip. I've seen this 1,000 times. It's called narcissistic injury. When you strip away the grandiosity and the lies, what's left is a very small, very fragile ego that cannot handle the weight of the truth. He wasn't angry at me because I was wrong. He was angry because I was right. And in his world, being right is the only currency that matters. I looked at him and I didn't raise my voice. I don't have to. The truth is loud enough on its own. I said, Leo, we've talked about what you do. Now I want to talk about why you do it. You spend every waking hour convincing yourself and everyone around you that you're a high-level intellectual, a creative force that is simply too refined for the modern world. But let's look at the fruit on your tree. At 38, you have no career, no savings, no partner, and your mother is your primary source of income. If I were to look at that fruit without knowing you, I wouldn't say, here is a genius. I would say, here is a man who is terrified of being average. Am I hitting the mark? He let out a short, dry laugh. Average is a choice, Phil. I choose not to participate in a system that devalues the individual. If that makes me unsuccessful by your metrics, then so be it. This is the intellectual fortress they build. If you can't succeed in the real world, you simply declare the real world wrong and create a new one where you are the king. I leaned forward, getting into his personal space. No, Leo, average isn't a choice for you. Average is your nightmare. You are so scared that if you actually went out there and tried, if you took that warehouse job or that entry-level marketing gig and you weren't the best at it, then your whole identity would collapse. You'd rather be a failed legend than a successful ordinary guy. Because a failed legend still gets to be a legend in his own mind. An ordinary guy is just one of us, and you can't stand the thought of being one of us, can you? For a second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, but a raw, naked fear. It lasted maybe half a second before he blinked it away and the mask slid back into place. I think you're overanalyzing a very simple desire for autonomy, he said. But his voice was thinner now. He was losing his grip on the room. I turned to Martha. Martha, you've been his audience for 38 years. You've applauded his vision and you've funded his exploration. You've been the one person who kept the lie alive for him. Do you realize that by protecting him from the world, you've actually been burying him alive? Martha started to cry then, not the soft, quiet weeping from earlier, but a deep, guttural sob of realization. I just wanted him to be happy, she whispered. I thought if I gave him enough time, he'd find his way. I didn't want him to struggle the way I did. I told her, struggle is the forge that creates character. You didn't protect him from struggle, you stole his character from him. You've treated him like he's made of glass, and now he believes he's made of glass. And glass breaks when it hits the real world. This is the harder part of my job, telling a mother that her love has been a slow-acting poison. But if she doesn't stop pouring it, he's never going to get sober from his own ego. Leo didn't like the focus shifting to his mother's pain. He tried to interrupt, to explain her emotions for her. She's just overwhelmed because of her age, Phil. It's not about me. It's about her lack of support systems. I didn't even look at him. I kept my eyes on Martha. He's doing it again, Martha. He's taking your pain and making it about his narrative. He's dismissing your feelings as a symptom of age or lack of support instead of acknowledging that he is the one holding the knife. How does that feel? Martha looked at Leo, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in a decade, without the lens of maternal guilt. It feels like I'm invisible, she said. It feels like I'm just a bank account to you, Leo. That was the breakthrough moment, or at least the start of one. Leo's face reddened. He stood up, pacing the small area in front of his chair. This is a setup. You've coached her to say this. You're trying to create a narrative of the victim mother for ratings. He was shouting now, his composure completely gone. The visionary was gone, replaced by a petulant teenager who had been told he couldn't have the car keys. I stayed seated. I stayed calm. I let him spin out. When a narcissist loses control, they will try to make everyone else as agitated as they are. If they can make you lose your cool, then they can claim you're the unstable one. I wasn't going to give him that. Sit down, Leo, I said, my voice low and steady. The only person making a scene here is you. You're proving my point with every word you yell. You're so desperate to stay the hero of this story that you'll even turn on the woman who has sacrificed her retirement to keep you fed. Is this the geniuses we're supposed to be admiring? A man who screams at his mother because she finally spoke her truth? He stopped pacing. He looked at the audience, looking for a friendly face, but he found none. He saw 100 people looking at him with pity, and for Leo, pity is worse than hatred. Hatred implies you're a threat. Pity implies you're pathetic. He sat back down, but he was vibrating with tension. I decided to push the confrontation to its logical conclusion. I brought out a list of the 10 habits of highly narcissistic individuals, and I started reading them one by one, asking him for a yes or no after each one. Sense of entitlement? I prefer the term standards, he said. Lack of empathy? I'm very empathetic to the human condition, just not to mundane complaints, he replied. Requirement for excessive admiration? I value feedback from peers, he countered. It was a masterclass in semantic evasion. He wouldn't admit to the labels, but his corrections were just synonyms for the very traits I was describing. I looked at him and said, Leo, you can change the words all you want, but you can't change the music. The music of your life is a funeral march for everyone who gets close to you. Your sister is gone. Your ex-wife is gone. Your mother is on the brink of a collapse. And here you are arguing about the definition of empathy. Let's get real. Do you want to be right or do you want to be well? Because right now, you're right all the way to a lonely, broke, and miserable middle age. Is that the destiny you've been talking about? For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. He sat there, his mouth slightly open, looking at the floor. The silence stretched out. I let it hang. In television, silence is usually an enemy, but in therapy, silence is a tool. It's the space where the truth finally gets a chance to breathe. I could see him trying to find a way out, a way to spin this, but the walls were too high. He was trapped in a room with his own behavior, and for a man who spent his life running from himself, that was the ultimate confrontation. I leaned in and whispered, it's okay to be ordinary, Leo. It's okay to just be a man who works a job and takes care of his mother. There is more dignity in a man who sweeps a floor to pay his way than there is in a genius who steals from his sister's wedding fund. You don't have to be special to be worthy of respect, but you do have to be honest. He looked up at me, and for the first time, his eyes were wet. The armor wasn't just cracked, it was falling off in pieces, but the question was, what would he do when the cameras stopped rolling? Would he go back to the lie, or would he finally start the hard work of becoming a real person? The silence in that studio was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it has a physical weight to it. I looked at Leo, and I didn't see the intellectual giant he had tried so hard to project for the last 40 minutes. I saw a man who was suddenly terrifyingly aware of the vacancy of his own life. When you've spent nearly 4 decades building a monument to yourself, and someone comes along and shows you it's built on a foundation of sand and someone else's social security checks, the realization can be paralyzing. I've seen people break down into tears, and I've seen people walk off the stage in a rage. Leo did something different. He just stared at me, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. He looked like he was waiting for me to tell him what to do next, because for the first time in his life, his own internal script had run out of pages. I leaned back and said, Leo, I want to talk to you about something called the payoff. In psychology, we know that people don't continue a behavior unless it's giving them something they want. You've been living this way for a long time. You've been draining your mother, alienating your sister, and staying stuck in neutral while the world passes you by. There is a huge cost to that, but there's also a payoff. Do you know what your payoff is? He shook his head slowly, the arrogance completely drained out of him. I told him, your payoff is safety. As long as you are a misunderstood genius who is too good for the world, you never have to put your ego on the line. You never have to find out if you're actually good enough to compete. You're playing a game where you've declared yourself the winner before the first whistle even blows. It's safe, it's comfortable, and it's absolutely killing your soul. That hit him harder than the parasite comment. For a narcissist, being told they are safe or scared is the ultimate insult because they want to believe they are bold, daring, and revolutionary. But the truth is, Leo was a coward. He was too scared to be a beginner. He was too scared to be the guy at the bottom of the ladder. I looked at Martha and said, and you, Martha, your payoff is that you get to keep him close. As long as he's broken and misunderstood, he needs you. It gives you a sense of purpose, even if that purpose is destroying both of you. You're addicted to the rescue just as much as he's addicted to the need. I had to make them both see that this wasn't just Leo's problem. It was a closed-loop system of dysfunction that they had both signed up for. I told them that if things didn't change today, not tomorrow, but today, Martha was going to end up in a state-funded nursing home with nothing to her name, and Leo was going to end up on the street, completely incapable of surviving because he doesn't even know how to balance a checkbook or cook a meal. I offered them a get real plan. It wasn't going to be a creative retreat or a visionary workshop. It was going to be intensive, one-on-one therapy for Leo to address the narcissistic personality traits and the underlying fear of failure. And for Martha, it was going to be boundary-setting training. I told her, you have to close the bank of mom. You have to tell him that as of 30 days from now, the room he's in is a rental and the rent is market rate. If he doesn't pay, he's out. No exceptions, no excuses, no creative delays. Leo's reaction to the plan was the true test. A person who genuinely wants to change will grab that lifeline with both hands. A person who is still stuck in the narcissistic loop will try to negotiate the terms. Leo tried to negotiate. I think the therapy is a good idea, he said, trying to regain some of his refined tone, but the 30-day limit seems arbitrary. It doesn't take into account the economic climate or the fact that I need a stable environment to focus on my recovery. I cut him off right there. Leo, the economic climate isn't stopping millions of people from going to work every single day. And your stable environment is just code for, I want to keep sleeping until noon on my mom's couch. The answer is no. 30 days, no negotiations. Do you want the help, or do you want to keep being the king of a one-bedroom kingdom? He looked at Martha, hoping for one last save. He gave her that look, the how could you do this to me look that had worked on her for 20 years. But Martha had heard the audience gasp when they heard the recording of him being cruel. She had seen her daughter's face. She had felt the weight of her own exhaustion laid bare on a national stage. She didn't look away. She said, 30 days, Leo, I'm tired. I'm just so tired. That was the moment the power shifted. The enabler had finally found her. No, and without the enabler, the narcissist has no floor to stand on. Leo sat back, looking defeated. But for the first time, he looked like a 38-year-old man instead of a spoiled child. After the show, I met them backstage. The cameras were still rolling for the walk and talk portion, but the energy was different. It was quieter, more somber. I walked with Leo toward his dressing room. I told him, look, I know you think I was hard on you out there, and I was, but I wasn't being hard on you. I was being hard on that fake version of you that's been holding you hostage. There is a real man under there somewhere, Leo. A man who actually has something to contribute. But that man is never going to show up as long as the genius has taken up all the oxygen. He didn't argue, he just nodded. He looked exhausted, which is a good sign. It means the defense mechanisms are too tired to keep fighting. I told him that the path ahead of him was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever done. He was going to have to go to a job where people didn't think he was special. He was going to have to take orders from people he thought were lesser than him. He was going to have to deal with the crushing boredom of an ordinary life without the high of his own grandiosity. I said, if you can survive being ordinary for 6 months, you might just find out that you're actually capable of being extraordinary. But you can't skip the ordinary part. You've been trying to fly without ever learning how to walk, and that's why you keep crashing. We set him up with a doctor in his hometown who specializes in personality disorders. We set Martha up with a support group for parents of adult children who struggle with failure to launch. As they walked toward the exit, I saw Leo reach out and take his mother's bag. It was a small gesture, something most people do without thinking, but for Leo, it was a massive step. It was an act of service. It was an acknowledgement that someone else's needs existed in the same space as his own. It wasn't a cure, and it wasn't a happily ever after, but it was a start. The reality of narcissism is that it doesn't just go away because of one aha moment on a stage. It's a daily, hourly struggle to choose empathy over ego. I knew as I watched them leave that the odds were against him. The payoff of the old life is very seductive. When the therapy gets hard, when the boss at the warehouse yells at him, when the rent is due and he doesn't have the money, the temptation to go back to being the misunderstood victim will be overwhelming. But for the first time in his life, the people around him knew the truth. The secret was out. The misunderstood genius had been unmasked, and in the end, that's the only way the healing can begin. You can't fix what you don't acknowledge, and Leo had finally been forced to acknowledge the man in the mirror. 6 months after the stage lights dimmed and the audience went home, I checked back in with Leo and Martha. I've lived long enough to know that a breakthrough on a television stage is just the beginning of a very long and often very painful journey. You don't undo 40 years of narcissistic programming in an hour, and you certainly don't change the fundamental nature of a personality overnight. When I followed up, the report was a mixed bag, which is exactly what I expected. Real life isn't a sitcom. There are no 30-minute resolutions that stick without a lot of sweat and a lot of backsliding. But the shift had begun, and in the world of psychology, a shift in direction is often more important than the speed of the travel. Leo had, to his credit, taken the warehouse job. It wasn't the creative director role he felt he deserved, and he spent the first 3 weeks calling his mother every day after his shift to complain about the intellectual vacuum of his coworkers. He told her his back hurt, his soul was being crushed, and that the supervisor was a small-minded tyrant who didn't appreciate his efficiency suggestion. In the past, Martha would have apologized, made him a special dinner, and told him he could quit and focus on his art until something better came along. But this time, Martha stayed strong. She had joined that support group I recommended, and she had a new mantra. I hear you're frustrated, Leo, but the rent is still due on the 1st. That is the sound of a boundary being drawn in the sand, and it was the most loving thing she had ever done for him. When she stopped cushioning his fall, Leo finally started to develop some calluses, not just on his hands, but on his ego. He had a major relapse about 3 months in. He got into a heated argument with a coworker who didn't follow Leo's superior method for sorting pallets. Leo lost his temper, used some of those big belittling words he liked to weaponize, and he got suspended for 3 days without pay. He came home and expected Martha to bail him out on the rent for that week. He went into the old routine, the pacing, the lecturing, the "you're killing my spirit" speech. Martha told me that for a moment, she almost buckled. The habit of saving him was like an old muscle memory, but she remembered what we talked about on that stage, that by saving him from the consequences of his own arrogance, she was effectively ensuring he would never grow up. She looked him in the eye and said, "If you don't have the rent, I'm going to have to ask you to move your things into storage and find a shelter because I cannot afford to carry you anymore." Leo was stunned. He realized that the Bank of Mom was officially closed for business. He didn't move out. He went back to work, apologized to his supervisor, which he said was the most humiliating moment of his life, and he kept his job. When I spoke to Leo on the phone for a follow-up, his voice sounded different. It was lower, less performative. He didn't use any 5-syllable words to describe his existential dread. He just said, "Dr. Phil, I'm tired. My back hurts, and I don't particularly like my life right now." I told him, "Leo, that's the best news I've heard all year." He asked me why, and I said, "Because for the first time, you're living in the same reality as the rest of us. You're not a legend in your own mind anymore. You're just a guy trying to make it, and that's a much better place to be than the palace of lies you were living in before." He actually laughed, a real, genuine laugh, not that dry, cynical chuckle he'd used in the studio. He's still in therapy, and he's starting to realize that his narcissism wasn't strength. It was a suit of armor he wore because he was too afraid to let anyone see how insecure he really was. He's learning that he doesn't have to be the smartest person in the room to be a person of value. He's even started helping Martha around the house without being asked. It's not much taking out the trash, doing the dishes, but for a man who used to treat his mother like a servant, it's a revolutionary act of humility. The lesson in Leo's story is one that I hope resonates with anyone who finds themselves blaming the world for their lack of progress. We all have an image of who we want to be, and sometimes that image becomes a cage. We get so invested in the idea of our greatness or our specialness that we stop doing the work required to actually be a decent human being. Narcissism is a lonely road. It's a road where you're always the hero, but you're always alone because nobody else can live up to the script you've written for them. Leo had to learn that the ordinary life he so despised was actually where the real meaning is found. It's found in the struggle, in the responsibility, and in the quiet dignity of paying your own way. He's not a visionary anymore, at least not in the way he used to define it, but he's a son who is finally showing up for his mother. He's a brother who sent his sister a genuine apology letter, one without any contextualizing or excuses. And he's a man who can look in the mirror and not have to lie about what he sees. As I told him in our last conversation, the truth will set you free, but first, it's going to make you miserable. Leo went through the misery, and he's coming out the other side. He's not perfect, and he never will be, but he's real. And in a world full of mass and grandiosity, being real is the most special thing you can be. Martha is finally getting the retirement she earned, not because she's sitting on a beach, but because she finally has the peace of mind that comes from knowing her son is finally, truly a man. And that's an outcome worth every bit of the hard truth it took to get there.